like I said, we're going to be in chapter 2 today. And as far as a current event goes, does anyone know that there was a current event that Christ specifically spoke of happened this morning in Tennessee? Nobody turned the news or the Weather Channel on this morning? Jesus said in Matthew 24 that there'd be earthquakes in various places. There was an earthquake in Tennessee this morning. 3.7. It was strong enough that they classify, I don't know how they classify it, but it was a 3.7, but it was a sturdy enough earthquake to break windows and knock books off shelves and knock things off shelves. And it was up in the north, the west corner, but could be felt all the way straight south into Memphis. So it was a pretty good sized earthquake this morning. Of course, it was nothing like what Mexico had experienced these last couple weeks ago. But even though it's a little earthquake, Jesus said that when the end of this age comes, that there would be earthquakes in various places at various times. We are seeing that natural disasters happening and occurring on a more frequent and more intense basis. He described those things as birth pains, as an intensification, if you will, as time progressed. And we're starting to see that. I mean, how often do you hear of an earthquake in the Midwest? It's not very often that we have them. But we do sit on a rather large fault line, the New Madrid Fault, and it has been known to make a mess of things. Matter of fact, it was the last time it shook, it was so bad the Mississippi River flowed backwards. And if you look at a map, a portion of Tennessee is not in Tennessee anymore because the river cut it off. So now it's on the outside of the river. It's kind of a neat little thing if you look at how the river flows, and that's all because that New Madrid shook. And it's a pretty strong one. As time progresses, you guys remember the Indonesian earthquake. That was 240 to 250,000 people died. Think about that. Almost 250,000 people in one earthquake. The tsunami done the damage, but it was an earthquake that started. These things are going to continue to grow, and as they do, we're going to kind of just get used to it. That's going to be a problem that we're going to have. We're going to become desensitized to it, that it's no big deal because it happens all the time. I mean, California's on fire right now. Well, it happens every fall, you know, no big deal. No, there were some earthquakes. Yeah, a lot of people died. When we hear these horrendous numbers, and when we see these huge devastations, and then next week there's another one that's even worse, and next week there's another hurricane, and then there's this and this, and as those things intensify, we become desensitized to it. It becomes, you know, it's just the way things are, you know. Tornadoes in the Midwest, earthquakes out west, and fires, and, you know, hurricanes in the west or east coast. I mean, there's a hurricane headed for Great Britain right now. How often does that happen? You know what I mean? Not very often. Matter of fact, I can't remember the last time it did. But when you see these things, and they're troubling because they are devastating, we just need to keep in mind that Christ is getting closer. That means we will soon be out of here. That also means as soon as we're out of here, who's left to share God's word? Have I reached everybody that I will be able to reach? And that's the burning question that we have. You got a question?
Yeah. When we are gone.
When we're gone, yeah.
When Christians are gone, do the graves open back up and the unsaved, are they out in this world again?
No. Nope. They stay right where they're at until the great white throne judgment at the end of the millennium. They are in Hades right now. Okay. Hades is an intermediate hell. Hell and Hades are not the same place. Hades is where the damned go, the souls of the damned go, the lost. They go there until that final judgment. and then they get cast into hell. It's in Revelation 20, I believe, maybe 21. Because God doesn't just put the lost, they don't just go there. If you read carefully, you'll see that death and Hades is also cast into there. Right now, remember what Jesus told the thief on the cross? Today you will be with me in paradise. Paradise, if you and I died right now, say I'm standing here, heart blows up, I'm dead, hit the floor dead. I don't go to heaven, so to speak. I go to paradise, Abraham's bosom. When Christ returns and everything goes through the system, then we go to the millennium, and then we go to final heaven. It comes in stages. And as we go through this, you guys will see that there is stages to where we're at and where we're going. You will not, and I will not have this body. I know you're looking at me like I'm crazy.
No, I think you said that. We'll go through the millennium and then you said the final hell?
No, the final stages.
Okay, I'm like, wait a minute.
No.
Oh, wait.
There's another rebellion at the end of the millennium, and then God puts an end to all rebellion, and after the millennium, we really don't know what happens. Heaven comes down, and that's where the story stops. Heaven is on earth. So I'm going to suggest that we'll be here, but those that have died right now, that are gone right now, they're in paradise with Christ, with all the saints of the ages gone by. They have a body, not this body. God gives us a new body. Shouldn't be that hard to imagine that God can give us a new body that's fit for eternity. We get that. When Christ comes back and all our bodies are resurrected, they're not so much resurrected as they're recycled. That's not necessarily a good word. They're restored and fit for eternity. This one, when I get it back, will have much better teeth than the one I have now will have. It'll be perfected. But for now, that body stays in the ground. The soul gets a new spacesuit, if you will, and goes to heaven. So the lost person who dies gets a temporary body and goes to Hades, which is still torment. And Hades and heaven can see each other, and we know that from the story of Lazarus and the poor man. And they can communicate. But it won't always be that way. So there will be some changes. And there's going to be a lot of changes as we go through. But the change that we need to be worried about the most and be concerned about is, am I washed in the blood of the Lamb, and is my name written in the Lamb's book of life? That is the change we have to be concerned with. Any change beyond that is just going to be fun. It's going to be enjoyable. It's going to be pleasurable. God's got a great plan for us. I don't understand the biology or the mechanics of it, but that's where faith and trust come in. I don't understand how he's going to do all that, but I understand he will. And that's the change that we have to be concerned about. Today we're going to be looking at terms. This chapter is kind of boring and kind of short. We look at the terms that are used to describe the end of this age. The end of this age is actually one of them. We're going to look at the latter days, end times, last times, latter years. Daniel's favorite there on page 15, they tell us, is the end of time. And as we go through these terms, more often than not, context will be our rule. That will be what we need to look at. When we're reading in Daniel, we will need to understand that Daniel was speaking from a purely Hebrew perspective. New Testament, they're speaking from a Christian perspective when they talk about these sort of things. Not all endings are bad. So when we read these at the end of time, the apocalypse, blah, 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 everybody always makes it out to be a terrible thing. It's not necessarily a terrible thing. Consider how many times have you ended a day? How many times have you ended a week? How many times have you ended a month, a year? Things end all the time. And it's not always a bad thing. I had tonsillitis for about a week. I was really glad when that came to an end. So when we read these things that something's ending, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Jesus always liked to use the end of the age. That was the term he would often use. A lot of times when like I said, when we're going through these, our context in the scripture will indicate to us whether we're talking about the end of the church age, the end of the tribulation age, or the end of the millennial age. Right now we live in what's considered the church age. From the day of Pentecost until now, and however many days are left, weeks or months that are left, this is considered the church age. And at some point, the church age will end. And when they talk about that ending, sometimes the word after these things. Sometimes the Bible will use next week, next month. They'll use those sort of terms, the end of this age, the end of that day. So what we have to do is just kind of make sure we're looking at the context to understand, is the writer of the book that I'm reading talking about something that's going to happen at the end of the church age, something that will happen at the end of the tribulation, something that will happen at the end of the millennium. And more often than not, that context, the paragraph it's within, will give us that indication. For Daniel, when we read through that and we go through those passages, it can be a little bit tougher because we often think from a Christian New Testament perspective. So when Daniel's talking, a lot of times we try to put the Christian perspective in on it, when actually we need to look at it with Hebrew eyes. He was talking about the end of the Hebrew age and what they will be facing and what they will see. So when he talks about the end, he's talking about all the way to the end. He's talking about the end of the tribulation period. And it helps us to understand where they're coming from and what they're talking about. There are two exceptions that they have noted for us on page 17. The first one is Hebrews 1 and 2. And the second one is 1 John 2:18. The Hebrews passage says, God, who at various times and in different ways spoke at different times in the past to our fathers through the prophets, but here in these last days has spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the worlds. The other term, last days, is used. But in this case, the writer of Hebrews is referring to the church age. And we can ascertain that through that whole passage. When we read through that, it gives us the indication and implication that God spoke to us through the prophets. Now he spoke to us through his Son during this time. And we are still living in that last time. That time that we're listening to Jesus. God hasn't spoken to us directly, so to speak, through another prophet. Jesus was that last one. And in 1 John, it talks about the last hour. Here he's referring to the system of grace, God's grace in which we live in right now. And he's talking about that many antichrists will arise during this time frame, this age of grace, this last hour. And as John lays this out here, he also says that many of antichrists have already arisen. So John is saying that here in this last hour, which is when he lived till about 100 AD. He was already referring to that time as the time of the end. And by doing so, he's talking about the church age and the many antichrists that have arisen. Now, look back through history. How many people could we say was a type of an antichrist? How many Stalins, Hitlers, Mussolinis? I can't think of the one that was in China, to be honest with you, right now. And through the middle, Chairman Mao. And all those, just millions of people killed. How many antichrists have there been that have infiltrated the church, if you will, and taught terrible doctrine and just heresies, just outright lies? These things, as John laid out, and what he's talking about, will increase as well. But when he's talking about that last hour, he's talking about this whole church age. John's saying that here in this last time. So the apostles were under the impression that their lives were in the end of the age, and so should we. They didn't know that it would last this long, because we don't know how much longer it will last either, neither do they. But those two are the two exceptions to the rule. They're talking about a term of time in a general sense. And that's where looking at context will help us. It'll help us to determine, man, that wind is blowing. And that door is opening a lot. It'll help us to understand what's going on and what's being talked about. The primary use for the last days, the end times, those are the terms that they primarily will use. And like I said, in the case of Daniel, he's talking about through the tribulation period. Trying to make sure I get all my notes in, because I said today's going to be kind of short. This chapter wasn't very long, and we're actually already to the end of it, and it's only 10 o'clock, so I'm going to have to maybe make some stuff up. Maybe ask a whole lot of questions. Another one that Joel uses, and the prophet Joel, is afterwards. That's a term that he'll use for the tribulation period, the end of the church age. For some reason, that was his favorite word. He would say, after these things, then this. After these things, then this. When he's outlining the end of the age as well. They do close up the chapter with some really good news. That millions of people, according to the prophet Joel, will be saved during the tribulation time. And he calls it a week. 7 days. That's why we understand it to be 7 years. Most people call it 7 to 10 years. Because the time of the rapture and the time of the tribulation period, when it starts, that starts with the Antichrist signing a peace deal with Israel for 7 years. There could be a time gap there between that period of time, the rapture, and then that signing of the peace deal. To be honest with you, the rapture could devastate the world, and it may take the world a couple years to get back up on its feet. I mean, think about it. You got a third of the population, a quarter of the population just up and disappears. There's going to be a lot of places like, hey, where's Joe? Why ain't he at work today? Great, now we can't run this machine or can't run that machine. Or what happened? That plane X was supposed to take off at 2 o'clock. Why is it still sitting on the runway? You know, there's a train sitting in Garrett that was supposed to leave 2 hours ago with all this freight on it, and it's still sitting there. Yeah.
No.
Oh, I thought you had to
No.
just waving.
Mhm.
Hey, how you doing over there, Deb? But what Joel tells us is that even though there might be a time gap, that God's going to pour out His Spirit on the world one last time, like it was on the day of Pentecost. And there will be 144,000 Jewish witnesses that will go out and evangelize. And they will last as long as God allows them to last. We'll read more about them in, I believe it's chapter 24 it says, but there's going to be an awful lot of witnessing. And I know a lot of people think, well, you know what? Here's the deal. I'm going to wait until the rapture. See everybody take off. And then I'll know this whole God thing is real. And then I'll accept Jesus as Lord. And that is foolishness. It's foolishness in the fact that if they really knew what they were going to be up against, they would be praying now, if they understood. And to be quite honest with you, if you don't accept God now, what makes you think you'll accept Him later? I mean, the excuse that you're using now, that, hey, you know what, life's a big deal, yeah, I'm having fun. That will still be an excuse that you'll use then. And God already warned us in Romans that the delusion that He sends is going to be massive. That people are going to have a hard time finding their way to Him. But it will happen. People will be saved. The Antichrist will hunt them down. They will be killed. And not necessarily pleasant ways. They will come to the opinion, and you guys may have already seen it if you watch the news any, that the world is just itching to get rid of Christians. But man, if we could just get rid of these Christians, just get them out of our hair so we could bring about our New Age utopian society. You know, it'd be great. But those darn backwards Christians and their stupid rules and their... We just can't have any fun with them around. That delusion is going to get real strong. And it tells us that a man's enemies will be within his own house. It will be like the way they go through it. Renee's saved. Ryan turns her in. Actually, the Bible makes it clear it'd be Bree that turns her in. So you can get some brownie points with the government. And it goes the other way too. You find out your kids are saved, and you got to put an end to that business. And that's how it's going to be during that time frame. It's going to be a lot of ugliness. Being saved now, getting right with Christ now, is the point. If you're not now, don't count on tomorrow. Who knows how much longer it will be until the world sees that big sign of all the Christians leaving. God could tarry, it could be another 100 years. And while you're waiting for that big sign, time passes and so does life. We can't wait. And I know there are people that are waiting, and they're going to be stubborn and keep waiting. And what we do in the interim is to pray for them and to be a solid and consistent witness. Do you have any questions today about this chapter, or about the terms, about the age in which we're living? Right. And that is I forget who said it. It might have been Stalin. Might even have been Hitler. They said, give me the children, and I'll change the next generation. And that's exactly what happened in Russia when communism took over. They started indoctrinating the children. They didn't bother with the mothers, fathers, and grandfathers. They got some of them to buy into it. But the biggest goal was the children. Then when that next generation arose and became adults, and even before then, they started turning their parents in. It happened that way with Hitler and Nazism too. He went after the children, and he got a generation of children to buy in, and Nazi youth. And they would turn their parents in, just like they did just like the communists did. And it only takes, 10 or 15 years. You have a country turned around. And that was a dark, dark, dismal place for a lot of years. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Be a lot of people lost without electricity, that's for sure. Yeah. A lot of things would shut down. I don't know how many people actually know how to start a fire and cook off a campfire out in the backyard. Yeah, I can do it. Yeah, this little corner of the world might be an exception to that rule, but yeah, there's not many that would be able to, start a fire. Yeah, that could be pretty smelly. There is no backyard to burn up. Any other questions? All right, I guess we're done a little early today. Next week we'll go over chapter 3. We will, really.